recently he's become part of what's called the European Distributed Institute of Taxonomy, otherwise known as EDIT, which is an online system attempting to coordinate the information on taxonomy in Europe. David will talk to us today about, I don't have his current title, so he'll have to announce that himself. All right, come on, David, please.
Thank you. There. I would like to begin by thanking profoundly the organizers for inviting me over here. This is my very first visit to Washington and to this wonderful institution, and I'm enjoying myself thoroughly. And I've particularly enjoyed the first two talks that have preceded me, and I love the idea, given the title here, Linnaean Systematics, Collaborative Taxonomy and the Web, Professor Broberg's ending remarks about needing lots of atoms kind of builds up to needing a whole family of atoms and this is really what we're trying to do here, to try and break down taxonomy and to make it useful. And I like to say that Jerry's done a great job for me in introducing the way I want to go about classification. We've all seemed to be going to be starting with a picture of somebody older than Linnaeus. And for me, I want to start off by trying to describe what I think Linnaean taxonomy is actually all about, which Jerry did much more eloquently, and I don't have a lot of time to go into that. But he wasn't the man who invented classification as such, because Aristotle did it, but Aristotle did it under what we now think of as philosophically more sloppy rules, because Aristotle's system was nested. And so if you were in the inner group, that was fine. And if you didn't make it into the inner group, then you were in the group outside of that. But Cowan defined taxonomy today as being like a stool with three legs. We have classification, identification, and nomenclature. And you can't take any one of those legs away and for the system to remain stable. Classification and identification, as far as Linnaeus were concerned, were essentially the same thing because the scope of Linnaeus's world was so much smaller. Today, it's so much bigger. And the drive to classification is different from the drive to identification. Any child will tell you the difference in a horse and a cow is which one says moo. But a taxonomist will tell you to look at the feet and count the toes. You know, come on guys, get a grip. So what we need to understand then is how do we make the Linnaean system of ranks, which is really, really important as Jerry was describing, and I think is fundamental to the way we analyze and understand the world around us and how we make use of the information and the names we apply to them. So I started out trying to think about this, and I started to do a SWOT analysis. Everybody here must have done a management course at some time and had to have done one of these damn things. So what's good about Linnaean systematics? Okay? Well, it's got a fabulous brand name. It's got immense authority, and more or less everybody is familiar with the idea of the Latinized binomial name. So we have a really rock-solid product. Unfortunately, it has problems. We have real problems over accessibility. I think that we have problems over expectations, what people think they can do with that information. And we certainly have problems over the predictive power that information carries. Well, okay, the opportunity obviously is to make it accessible and to meet those expectations, although the problem then is determining what those expectations might be. But what about the threats? The threats are that because of the lack of accessibility, many of our colleagues in ecology have started to analyze ecosystems by function and by property, and they've done it without recourse to identifying the players in the game. Therefore, they have got ecological processes without ever needing to name the organisms present. And if that system catches on and takes off and finds application, then Linnaean systems might as well pack up and go home because we don't need it anymore. add to that the concept of fingerprinting. If you can just get a little bit of DNA, you can produce a barcode, and that'll tell you who you are. Then what matters? That its name, its nearest phylogenetic relatives. And of course, the phyllocode itself is designed to replace Linnaean systematics. Now, there's one thing that I couldn't fit onto this diagram, and that's the codes of nomenclature. And the reason for that is that I started to argue it out with myself, and I thought, well, the codes of nomenclature lend stability, so that's a strength, right? But they get in the way, so that's a weakness. And they actually inhibit progress, so that's a threat. And so basically, the codes seem to fit in all four boxes. And we need to be able to move forward with the codes under some understanding of usage. And the codes of nomenclature were designed for that twig there and that twig there. And pretty much the rest of it was considered to be unimportant. But this lot is what makes the ecosystem go. These are the things that actually drive most ecosystem function. They're the things that do all the recycling, get all the global mineralogical cycles working for us, and make the ecosystem productive. The microbial loop, which you may or may not have heard of, is the system describing what's happening in the microbial level. And only about 10% of the carbon that's in that microbial loop ever gets out into the big guys. And so that's why this engine is so important. And unfortunately, what's happened is the fungi are here, and they're, by convention, handled by the botanical code. Here, the alveolates are mostly animals. The cryptophytes are mostly botanical. Strominophiles are mostly botanical. So trying to navigate your way across this network of names under these codes gives us a real problem. And so we end up with lots of groups, particularly around here and around here, where the organisms have to carry two sets of names. They have one set that is completely valid under the zoological code, and they have a different set which is valid under the botanical code. And that's got to be crazy. And so basically, the one thing I would really, really like for Christmas, if somebody can make the codes recognize the other code, because that would make life so much easier. So the problem that I'm trying to get to is the codes are fine, nomenclature's fine. How do we organize the ranks and bring these things into a single system? And Linnaeus couldn't do it because basically he didn't ever recognize these things down here and didn't do any significant work with them. And he simply put a line across here and said, well, these fish are outside of the other two. And that was the end of the story. I want to draw your attention to this. These brown things here are Naturae meningitis. This is the causative organism for bacterial meningitis. Generally speaking, it's fatal in about 4 days. So it's kind of important that we can identify it and work with it. But this little group here is clearly evolving out of meningitis and is Neisseria gonorrhea, causative organism for the sexually transmitted disease, gonorrhea. And the primary difference between gonorrhea and meningitis is that this one lacks a capsule because it's transmitted in bodily fluids. This one has a thick capsule because it's airborne. Its transmission route is through coughs and sneezes. If we follow a phylogenetic route, then we have to break meningitis into at least 2 different species complex. Otherwise, we have to live with a paraphyletic assemblage. But at a practical level in a hospital lab, who cares? This is what I mean about understanding user needs for our nomenclatural systems. So, phonetic classifications are generated by assigning organisms to groups on the basis of overall similarity. When I teach to students, I generally put a slide up which I didn't think would go down well over here, which says, phylogenetics is interesting, but phonetics is useful. And basically, the point I was trying to make is that phylogenetic classifications are not inherently more stable, more objective, or more predictive than phonetic systems. And in fact, they are generally less predictive in many circumstances, because in general, you pick the characters that you want to be predictive over. But this process is intrinsically difficult, and we started off trying to make this a Venn diagram looking at the overlap for the areas, and we decided that there actually isn't an overlap between the author and the reader. There is a routing through these intermediate structures, but there isn't a distinct overlap, so it's very hard to communicate the idea of the taxon from one person to another, and therefore what should be in and what should be out. And as has been pointed out, the name is a label that sits under a literal string and is tied in some way to the taxon. And as Jerry started to talk about at the end, with the type system in place, then the establishment is an ostensive property, which means that it's linked by example. So you don't have to be identical to, and you don't have to fall within the pigeonhole box, but you do have to be part of the same cloud in some sort of identification space, which is what an ostensive property is. And this taxon here can either be individual specimens or it can be other taxa, depending on the rank that this name is going to use. So if you accept that structure, what can we do with it? Well, here's a different representation. We have the instances down here, a whole bunch of instances, and we have a recognition of the groupings of those instances in this taxon layer, because the taxon is literally just a grouping of instances. And the taxa are then tagged with a name up in this level up here. And you can see up here we've represented a scheme where names A, B, and C are synonyms up here of one representation that goes on down here. And when you go to read the literature, and going back again to Jerry's problem of reading back through 250 years of literature, it's the rationalization of the usage of these names back down to what they really mean that gives us most of our problems. And so if you kind of cut through a section of that diagram, what you've got is a bunch of instances here. The cloud around here is the definition, which in this is A, gives you the large cloud. But B and C are subviews of the same cloud, a more strict definition of some taxon. Which is right, which is most recent, that's an expert panel decision. But in general, we take the last synoptic review as being the correct one. And for reasons that aren't altogether clear but have a lot to do with the position Jerry closed on, those synoptic reviews are getting a lot more rare. The ones that I use in my field mostly were published in the 1930s to 1950s. And there aren't very many that were published in the second half of the last century. They still occur, but they're getting fewer. And their range is getting much smaller. What those ecologists want is a single book that will give them all of the sponges, say, or whatever it is they're looking at. And so they need large-scale synoptic reviews. The sort of thing that Jim was talking about with Encyclopedia of Life. They want to be able to get access to a wide swathe of information and be able to drill down to find out what they want. They don't want to have to go to a library and look at primary alpha literature, which is where we all get the brownie points for getting promotion. So, what do we have that's concrete? When we talk to computer scientists about this kind of problem of how representation, we end up usually banging our heads against a wall for about 6 months, because computer scientists like things to go into pigeonholes. They like to be able to define classes that they can work with and handle objects within data sets and move things around. That means at some point, something's got to be tangibly real. And there's very little in systematics that is tangibly real. What is real is that at some point, a publication will define a name. But it's that combination of the name record and publication that is real, not the name itself, not what the name represents, I mean. The name will often refer by some linkage to another name, and that'll come back to the publication again. So this fairly simple loop here is what we think of as being a tangible, it's generally known as something called the name usage. So you take your Latin binomial, somebody uses it in some way, that's a name usage, and you can nail it down because it's actually in a publication. Now, formal concept analysis is a mathematical process that allows us to take two views of a problem, an extensive and an intensive view, and they differ by basically the number of objects in these things through the hierarchy. So here you've got character representation, so there are more characters in common at the lower level and fewer at the top. And here in the extensive set you have specimens, so you have lots of specimens in the top and one or two in the bottom of the hierarchy. So this is a species, this might be a family or a genus. And sitting between the two is the name hierarchy. So this formal concept representation allows us to get into set theory and use set theory to analyze what's going on with systematics, with nomenclature in particular. You may be aware that conventional set theory, so-called classical set theory, doesn't work very well with systematics because there are a variety of constraints that were brought about through number theory, in particular failings of classical set theory to deal with the problems of nested memberships that means this is really the only way of getting to the mathematical basis of relationships. And if we combine this with a mathematical technique called rough set comparisons, rough set theory, what that gives you is a kind of fuzzy matching. What rough set theory does is say, I'm going to give you this boundary, this white layer here is a boundary region. So the dark green, is definitely in. So is this a member of my set? Yes. Easy. You're in the dark green. In the light green out here, is this a member of my set? No. You're in the light green. But what happens to babies? Well, in rough set theory, you're allowed to put them in this white area here. And that means that you have now a three-state instead of a two-state solution to the problem. And we can take two representations of a taxon concept, and we can map that one onto that one, and if they map like that, then that set is fully within, that dark green set is fully within this light green set, then everything's fine. Those two are potentially compatible taxon concepts. If they're not, if any of the dark greens here fall in any of the light greens here, then the taxon concepts are incompatible. And that gives you a way of managing data absence. So turning this into practicality, what we can do is look at any of these taxon groups here in this hierarchy. If we insert or remove a name, so here you've got this P taxon here, here has been removed, then you still have the same lineage going up here as you had here, except for the presence of the P. And that's a relatively easy thing to test for. So you're not looking for a literal string equivalence, you're not looking for the presence of all members, you're looking for compatibility of these strings. And here, these are different concepts. So this P is quite a different thing from this P over here. And this is the same representation with the class theory. So we have a mechanism now, a set of mathematical tools that will allow us to compare hierarchies, to extract information from easily obtainable published records. So as we heard earlier, Linnaeus was acutely aware of the problem of missing information. He was aware that you couldn't make a completely stable classification until you had complete information. If you haven't examined all the species in a genus, then you can't fully define the genus. In general, we have found taxonomic information normally becomes available only in little bits and pieces. You get a little fragment at a time. And as knowledge advances, taxonomic systems inevitably have to change. To set yourself the goal of gathering all the information on the taxon before you classify it is of Herculean proportions and is practically impossible. So we must design systems of access and availability and practicality that are robust against missing data. One of the, I can't help but think of as quaint rules that were insisted on by the codes of nomenclature were that both botanists and zoologists were adamantly opposed to the creation of a journal of record. This didn't happen in the bacteria, where they have a journal of record. You can still publish anywhere you like, but you've got to send a small note to the journal of record to say this name has been created at this citation, that's all. That means that the problem of locating all of the names in a given taxon can be immense, because a lot of these things, I mean, our museum has probably got one of the largest and most extensive libraries, and we don't hold these things, and that's why we know they're hard to find. We've got reprints of them for those. These all contain, actually, they're cryptomonad flagellates appear in all of these things, and we've got reprints of all of these, but we don't have the journal runs. So the problem of getting access to data is huge. Now, we have on the horizon the Biodiversity Heritage Library, which is going to set about scanning the world's biodiversity publications. And many of these things were published, are old. They're certainly pre-1920s. But they're also obscure. There aren't many copies in the world, and when do we think BHL is going to get around to these tiddly little publications? They're going to focus all their effort on the big and important publications. It's a real problem. So EDIT set about trying to form a federation between taxonomists to work out how taxonomists work, how we can facilitate and make easier the access to these names. And we argued that we need written manuscripts because that's how people get promoted. We need specialist databases because that's the easiest thing for us to use, and that thing allows us to make our information most readily available. And really they need to be on web pages so other people can find them quickly and easily. And EDIT proposes a centralized well, it doesn't have to be centralized, but it has to be a single structure of communicating warehouses that are responsible for two functions of storage and distribution. Oops. So if you start primarily with manuscripts, then we need to extract the information out of those manuscripts, but you don't know in general what information you're going to want. And so there are a number of markup languages that have been introduced which allow us to tag information elements within a manuscript that can be subsequently analyzed by anybody who needs to know. So here we have a markup system that is beginning to tell us about known data, genus name, species, and there's the data itself. So a computer program can read this manuscript and can actually make sense of what it's seeing. It can find within the data flow, the text flow, the segments that are the description, the segments that are the synonymy list, the segments are that represents the authority, and so on and so forth, the things that you are likely to want to know. But what if you want to know about all the things that live above 1,000 meters in a particular country? Well, is that going to be in the description? Probably not. It's probably not part of the formal diagnosis. It's going to be in the larger discussion section of the document, or the larger, more flowing natural language description. And so this drill down problem is very severe, but if we can find the taxa, overlapping geographic range, and give you that just natural language block, then maybe you can do something with it. So what we're trying to drive at is an incremental way of adding value to the information. Now, the warehouse model, you're not meant to be able to read this slide. The warehouse model that we're proposing is inevitably incredibly complicated. Although I showed you that first flowchart, which basically had the publication and the name usage and a link to another publication, that's it. When you actually map it out in a computerized database, you get something like this. And this is the Berlin model, which is going to form the basis of the EDIT common data model. And in order to populate this, somebody who read that has to understand where all those data elements go in relation to one another in this structure. And that's a hell of an ask. Because I've worked with this and I don't understand it. I've designed one like this and I don't understand that either. Because it gets so complicated. It's the implications of when you come up against a new instance, what do you do with it? You have to make decisions on the fly all the time. Inevitably, those decisions become subjective, and you've lost the very objectivity you're trying to drive for. So we need tools to populate this kind of structure from the markup structure. So the EDIT game plan, if you like, is to try and do something like this. We are going to build the data warehouse here, which is going to be accessed by something called a scratchpad, which I'll talk about in a minute, through a bunch of tools that will help you to write a new manuscript, which gets you promoted and keeps you in a job. That will be marked up, will be fed back through an XML analysis repository back into the data warehouse again. And various organizations can get access at various levels and various stages. That's the plan. So, the scratch pads. So what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about is how we can address this problem of accessibility and this lack of synoptic monographs to keep Linnaean systematics relevant and available to the modern community. So the scratch pads are simply hosted websites with a bunch of tools that are relevant to taxonomists. They are intended to encourage community building, our families of atoms. They are unbranded, so if you want one, you get one, it's white. How you characterize it and the image you portray through it is a community decision, not ours. We're not imposing that on you. And similarly, we don't tell you what to put on it. That's entirely also your decision. And we get a set of tools that will facilitate the building into your data of increasing levels of structure. Almost all the data people start off with is either in Excel or Word files. It is almost never structured. To be useful for most practical purposes, and certainly for cross-fertilization purposes, it needs to be structured. So, the game plan, simply take your data, submit it via web forms, and you build a scratchpad. And most people with a modest amount of computer knowledge can have, from no web presence, can have a respectable web content in about half a day. Technically, the way this is being done is through technology called LAMP, which is Linus, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. You don't really need to understand that, but it's the reason for telling you is it's a robust, open source, public domain software system with a large user community. Loads of people are building tools in this system, and it's all backed up using IBM's industrial weight server so that we will keep the thing up and active. Fill out an application form if you want one. We require of you that it has a biological focus. You must agree to our terms and conditions, which fundamentally say anything you put on the site is your own responsibility. And we require that you use Creative Commons license so that anybody else can use the information as well in a non-commercial way. send it to us. Technically, we then need your name, we need the scope, which is the biological focus, and we need a mission statement, which will advertise here what your site is for, so that somebody, when they first sign up to it, can see a goal statement at the top. We built this system in February this year. We launched it April this year, and at the 1st of September we had 200 registered users, and we had generated 40,000 pages of content. Now, many of those pages of content were placeholders. They were simply a taxon name. But the point is that we seem to have hit on a requirement for people to get this stuff visible. Because again, as Jerry said, if you publish a simple alpha taxonomy paper, a new species description, people need it, but it's really, really hard work getting it published anywhere that is readily accessible. The web is the way to go for this. In order to make the process of building the Scratchpad easier, there's a bunch of screencasts which basically lead you through the process of designing what you want to do. So although it's easy to put just a block of text on the screen, there are better ways of doing it, and we will show you how to do it. You can incrementally increase the quality of the data and usability. And for anyone tempted, you can take this sandbox, as we call it, will reset itself every hour, so you cannot possibly break it. So you can play with it, you can try putting things in it, you can see what it can do, and away you go. And this has turned out, again, to be very successful. People worry about the longevity and the stability. They come here, they have a play with it, they're satisfied, and they go and they carry on. There's a set of tools that we have added to the thing already, and we are adding more tools as the program progresses. We will write tools that are generically useful, by which I mean useful across the breadth of the community. We don't write tools that are good for one Scratchpad only. You can do that for yourself. Here's an example of a tool that has been added because more or less everybody needs to have some form of geographical statement, and we use Google Maps. You're required to sign up for Google Maps as well, but given a data set of longs and lats, you can cast them onto the map, no problem at all. Very simple. We support multiple classifications. We allow basic editing, and you can classify your content. So you can drill down in any given presentation through multiple pages to see increasing a level of detail. We can lift content directly from places like UBio or your Excel files. We can manage bibliographies. There is a bibliography module. And one of the things that's interesting about the Scratchpads and the building of communities in this way is that the community needs to establish for itself a level of trust. And building common bibliographies within a community is something everybody needs to do. But it's relatively cost-light, and it's relatively risk-free, because bibliographic data are not proprietary in any way. It's a question of the effort of digging it out, that's all. And what we found is most communities start by building shared bibliographies. That gives them the basis of a level of trust that other people are playing fair, they're playing nice, and they go on then to add other things and build other content on top. So the publications are really, really much more important to us because of that community glue effect. We have got a module that handles images, and we're looking for better ways of doing this because lots of people come in with large numbers of images and they want to be able to annotate them en bloc quickly, and most of the tools that are currently available don't do that. And there's a wonderful system within the Drupal environment that allows you to build customized data types. So you can build a data type to accommodate any kind of data you want. We administer the site, that is to say we physically host the server You have an unlimited number of site users. When it says template user roles, we by default allocate a role to the person responsible for the site, which is the maintainer. You have editors, you have users, and you have anonymous users. And you can give them rights to do various things like change the content or not at your discretion. That's part of the growing of your organic group. The system routinely logs everybody that comes in. It also has tools for stopping the distribution of spam. We use OpenID as a technique for single-site login, so once you're logged in here, you can then log through to other sites using the OpenID protocol, and so on. And we are going to be adding, we're working on this right now, this one-click backup. So this kind of big red button that if you hit it, you'll get a core dump of your database delivered to you as a zip package, and you can take it away and you can mount it somewhere else if you want. But the point is that your data are never locked up in this system. They are not ours, they're yours. So, in summary, where I'm trying to go with this is the structured data is where we want to get to. That's up there in the clouds, and that's what EOL would like to present. That's what iSpecies want. Vital is a library system that gives you access to online versions of documents. But most taxonomists are sort of struggling down here in a sea of unstructured data. And so the scratch pads basically are a ladder to get you up into that structured content. But every step up gives you a usable product. What we're trying to do is to say, well, okay, structured data is absolutely wonderful, but the labor of structuring data is very, very hard work. With a scratch pad, every stage gives you a better product that the world can see, but the first stage gives you a product the world can see and use. And that's really important for uptake rates and getting engagement of people to come in. I'd just like to acknowledge my colleagues here who have all contributed in various ways. What I've tried to present to you this morning, is a view of what we think is the way that Linnaean systematics can make itself useful in the 21st century. As I said, I think the threat that is coming to us is that there are a number of protocols and procedures that actually could do away with the need for binomial names because there are tools and techniques that don't need them. There are huge advantages in using them, particularly in the level of communication and sharing of knowledge of a variety of types. And I think that the accessibility is the key. We need to understand what our users need from taxonomy, and we need to make that information available to them. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. And they're free. Yeah. An excellent question to which I wish I knew the answer. Ubio has got a wonderful set of tools. And Jim, do you want to say anything about the relationship between Ubio and EOL and GBIF and all of that stuff? I think Jim may be better positioned. think that what's also become clear is there are a number of these initiatives, such as EOL and the UBio initiative, EDIT, GBIF, and so on and so forth. We all talk to each other. We all cross-collaborate because it has become clear that the scale of the problem we're taking on, particularly in relation to this requirement for structured data, is such that we can't fight over this. There's plenty of problem to go around. That's an extremely interesting question, and I need another hour now. Fundamentally, the argument is often made that print publication gives us great longevity and access, and that's true if you work here or if you work in the NHM in London, but you try that at the tip of southern Chile when you're actually trying to identify something. You know, what kind of library have you got, you know, when you're actually out there in the field? So accessibility to these rare and difficult publications is a real problem. It's not as good as it's often cracked up to be, especially with the hugely expanding, the rate of expansion of knowledge. The other thing is that I think that in practice, if we see things like the scratch pads becoming the standard synoptic revisionary work, it's a dynamic thing, it's going to go on, then people are going to use the names that are in those scratch pads, whether they're legal with the codes or not. And so, personally, I love books. I would always write something down on paper. I have little confidence that our libraries will keep pace through the next 100 years as they have because of the volume. I think we need to go electronic. Sure. I mean, it's like I said, I think it's a volume problem.
Hi, I'm not a taxonomist, not even a biologist, really, but I would be a user down deep in the water. But I am working at an herbarium, so I would like to identify the plants. And I just wanted to ask, is this available now for people like me? And also, I'm very interested in going deeper into what's going on, just out of my own curiosity. But also I need some kind of a summary that says, okay, this is the name that used to be used. This is the name that's now used pretty much by many people. This is the name we're moving towards. I kind of need to know at the very top, not what all the scientists are working towards, but sort of where's the state of that right now? Kind of a percentages. But also I appreciate not just being told that, but being able to go in and see what's going on. So that is very valuable as well. So
that's basically what I mean by a synoptic monograph. It's when a group of experts comes together and agrees that this is the current name we should be using, these are the synonyms. If you do it on the web, and there are a few of these things around, then you do have the capacity to drill down and you can get more information so you can synthesize for yourself a view of what's happening. The tools to build this is available now. The content is not yet there. That's what's coming. But it's intriguing that granting agencies will give you money to build the tools. There are very, very few that will give you any money to put content on them. And few taxonomists get any career credit for putting content on the web. And that's part, so the system is wrong. No, it's not wrong. The system is weighted against the creation of content. Far be it from me to say it's wrong.
I'm Karen Reeds. I'm the curator of an exhibition on Linnaeus in America that was at the American Swedish Historical Museum earlier this year in Philadelphia. One of the things that I have encountered all too often is the problem of spelling Linnaeus's name. And we have seen, my proofreader's eye has caught several misspellings or different spellings, let's say, on the slides this morning. Which leads me to my question for you, and that is, how do you get things corrected in your system? If we can't even agree, if we can't get Linnaeus's name spelled right, how are we going to get the names of these organisms in agreement?
Within the sort of scratchpad type tool, and then you have a community that has to decide for itself how it accepts corrections. If you own a scratchpad, you can set up the role of editor, and any editor can go in and make a correction. Because of the nature of the way the databases work these days, we can roll back. So if one editor makes a correction and another editor disagrees, you can roll back to the earlier version. And for taxonomy, it's really important that you know what this page said on the 13th of November 2007 when you're looking in 2012, you see. Now, the problem of orthographic variations is not restricted, of course, to Linnaeus's name, and is particularly acute for names that are not based in a Latin language, Latin-rooted language. So that, for example, there's a prolific author called Jankowski in my own field, and there are at least a dozen orthographic variations of his name in English or German or French, because it does depend on the target language in which when the transliteration is done. So you need alias tables. Now, as a rule, I think it's probably best to go away from the idea of the correct name and think of the appropriate name for the circumstances you want to use. And as long as you can move between them, then it's really not a problem. And that would be the target, that within that simple block schema I showed you, at the bottom you had author, and there were lots of cards. And the idea was that there is a synonymy table there, that this author is also known as Lynnae, Linnaeus, and so on, you see. So the different representations of the name depending on the circumstances. But the question of correction bears on to the whole issue of data quality. And I personally view it as absolutely essential that the community can refine statements that are put up, because none of us are perfect. So it's really, really important that when somebody finds a mistake, that they can go in and correct it. If you have to send an email and say, hey, I found a mistake on such and such a page, then pretty much the person who's receiving those emails will either A, not receive any, or B, will get swamped by them. And either way around, the errors don't get corrected. So I want this out in the community personally, and that's the way we're designing our tools.
Linnaeus is 300 years old, well, at least his birthday is 300 years old, and we're still talking about correct versus appropriate names. Great. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to have one more thing that's not on the schedule before you break for lunch. Dr. Ovi Hagelin, who is the rare book consultant at the Hagerstromer Library in Stockholm, which is where Linnaeus's copy of Systema Naturae is kept, has agreed to give us a short presentation on how this volume was actually found and something about the history of it. And I think after you hear his presentation, you'll much more appreciate what we have in the exhibit in the rotunda. We will then break for lunch on your own for an hour.
The celebrations of Linnaeus' tercentenary includes a grand word tour for his Systema Naturae, the most epoch-making and celebrated work ever published by a Swede. The first edition was published in December 1735 and was, with the exception of his doctor's thesis, the first of the 13 works Linnaeus published during his 3-year stay in Holland. The Systema Naturae consists of only 7 leaves in large folio, 50 by 60 centimeters, including the 3 double-page tables of the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms. When the 12th edition was published 33 years later, the last one edited and enlarged by Linnaeus himself, the number of pages had increased to 2,374 bound in 4 octavo volumes. The first edition is one of the greatest rarities among the books listed in Horblitz's 100 books famous in science, which all were exhibited at the Grolier Club in New York in 1964. It was then described as a basic work by the father of modern systematic botany, which was virtually the inauguration of the classification of plants and animals. During my investigations, I traced 45 copies spread around the world, but I'm sure there will be more to find. I've already found 4 more copies during the last week in the United States. 2 at Harvard, 1 at the New York Public Library, and 1 in the American Museum of Natural History. A probably large part of the edition was printed on just one side of the paper with blank verses. These sheets did not sell and remained at the printers, who wanted to reuse the paper, when Grunovius, who had paid for the printing of the Systema Naturae, took care of the entire stock and cut the sheets into 2 pieces, using the blank side for mounting dried plants for his herbarium. Grunovius' famous herbarium later came into the hands of Sir Joseph Banks, whose collection is now part of the Natural History Museum in London. Some years ago, I got permission to examine some of these type specimens, not for botanical interest, but for bibliographical research. And I found some plants, I think they were from Pennsylvania, mounted on paper with the Systema Naturae letterpress text on the verso. It will perhaps be worth collating more of these herbarium leaves in search for proof sheets. Within short, we hope to start a project to make a census of the first edition of Systema Naturae, when we will thoroughly describe all copies we are able to trace and find out their provenances. The most valuable copy of this famous book, however, is the one preserved in the Hagerstromer Library, which copy must be considered a Swedish national treasure. It may be of interest to tell how this copy was discovered. One late autumn evening in 1977, the members of a bibliophile club were invited to the library of the Swedish Society of Medicine by its treasurer, himself a well-known bibliophile. Before dinner, the members stepped down the stairs to the cellar where some 400 shelf meters of monographs and a considerable collection of old medical periodicals were stored. The most prominent member of this club was Dr. Sten G. Lindberg, former chief of the Department of Conservation at the Royal Library and an internationally respected expert on the history of books and book bindings. Suddenly, someone requested to see a narrow but very tall volume sticking up among the books on the folio shelf. The book was taken out and shown to Dr. Lindberg, who exclaimed, "Good gracious, this is something absolutely incredible." The tall and thin volume, preserved in its original calf binding, had its title on the upper cover in gilt lettering, Lynnae Systema Naturae. The normal size for the first edition of this book is large folio, but in this copy the 7 folio leaves were first folded vertically and then bound, a format Linnaeus himself preferred, making it more convenient to handle and easier to fold up the large double-page tables. Another member participating on this special occasion was Dr. Birger Strandell, whose Linnaeus collection, one of the greatest in the world, had been sold some years before to the Hunt Botanical Library in Pittsburgh, now a center for Linnaean studies. On a closer examination by Dr. Strandell, he noticed 2 small but extremely important words written in ink on the title page, Exemplar Auctoris, and Dr. Strandell recognized Linnaeus' handwriting. This copy of the rare first edition of Systema Naturae now turned out to be not only a beautiful copy in its original binding, but the author's personal copy, something that up to this moment had escaped notice for nearly 2 centuries. Upon further examination, there were also found a few small corrections in ink in the text. One of them is found in the table of Regnum Animale under Insecta, where Cancer has got 12 feet, Pedes 12, which is a misprint corrected by Linnaeus to Pedes 10, because the crayfish has only 10 feet. This copy also contains the rare Methodus leaf that was published separately in 1736. In this, the author's own copy, there is also inserted the famous plate illustrating the 24 classes in Linnaeus' sexual system of plants, drawn, engraved, and hand-colored by Georg Dionysius Eret, the great flower painter of the 18th century. This plate, dated 1736, is extremely rare, hitherto known in just a handful of copies. The very first copy of this plate to come to the knowledge of Linnaean scholars was the one Dr. Erik Waller, the well-known collector of medical books, in 1938 succeeded to acquire at £5 and 6 shillings from Weldon and Wesley antiquarian booksellers in England. A seemingly identical plate with the 24 figures illustrating Linnaeus' sexual system was, however, already well known. But it was now apparent that there were 2 editions, and the one that Waller had purchased was Eret's original plate, from which all later versions are copied. The first piece of plagiarism, or what we called second edition, is the plate in Linnaeus' Genera Plantarum in 1737, which has the 24 figures numbered 1 to 24 and placed in 4 rows, with 6 figures in each row, while in Eret's original engraving they are marked in alphabetical order with A to C, placed in 6 rows and with 4 figures in each row, with all the figures of stamina and pistils splendidly colored by hand, while Linnaeus' plate is uncolored. Eret's original also has a somewhat different wording in the heading and is signed and dated by Eret in the copper plate. The plate has since then appeared in various versions to illustrate several other botanical books. The first Japanese version is a woodcut found in Udagawa Yuan's Shokugaku Keigen from 1834, a pioneering and influential book that introduced Linnaeus' classification system of plants into the Far East. During his stay in Holland, Linnaeus was employed by the rich banker George Clifford and moved in at his estate Hartekamp in September 1735. There he lived and worked as Clifford's house doctor and as inspector of his botanical garden with greenhouses, at that time the greatest in Northern Europe. There Linnaeus completed his manuscripts, which were printed and published in Holland. The botanist Johann Fredrik Gronovius helped Linnaeus with proofreading. His house at Rappenburg 52 in Leiden was next door to the printers. Together with the Scotchman Isaac Lawson, he also paid for the printing of the Systema Naturae. The printing of several other works by Linnaeus had already started during the autumn of 1735, but Linnaeus was eager to have the Systema Naturae to appear in print before his other works. We do not know exactly when Eret first met Linnaeus, and if his plate may have been intended for the Systema Naturae, but in such case it was not finished in time. In his diary, Eret writes, when he was in Leiden, that he heard of the young Linnaeus who was working for Clifford at Hartekamp. With a number of pictures of plants under his arm, which he had newly painted on vellum, in England, he traveled by foot to Hartekamp. Clifford asked Eret if he wished to sell his paintings and bought nearly all of them for 3 gulden apiece. Afterwards, Eret was employed by Clifford to draw living plants at Hartekamp. Within less than a month, he had completed 20 of the 36 plates that were to illustrate the most magnificent work ever published by Linnaeus, the Hortus Cliffordianus. Although Linnaeus showed how he wished to place the stamens and pistils and other parts of the plant, Eret wrote in his diary that he did not take instructions from anyone. He was the opinion that he could draw the flowers as he had always done, long before he had even heard of Linnaeus. After his séjour at Hartekamp, Eret returned to England, where he lived the rest of his life. As regards the so-called second edition, the one in Genera Plantarum, Eret complains in a letter to Linnaeus, dated the 18th of July 1738, that he had heard that Gronovius had made a copy of his table, which is sold for 10 stivers. Eret therefore ordered his agent Stockhoven to sell all the remaining copies of the engraving for 8 stivers apiece. On to our tour with the Systema Naturae to celebrate the tercentenary of Linnaeus started at the National Museum in Stockholm. Then the book went to Japan, when I had the honor to demonstrate the book for the Emperor Akihito, himself a devoted marine biologist, and to Empress Michiko in the presence of our Swedish king and queen. It is indeed not often I have an opportunity to show one of the 30,000 rare books in the Hagströmer Library for an emperor and a king at the same time. I will finish my short presentation to tell that I am working together with Dr. James Dobrev to describe another Systema Naturae in the Hagströmer Library. It is a manuscript in the same size as the printed edition that has been kept in the Karolinska Institute Library since 1816, when it was taken over from the old Collegium Medicum Library. There are still a few minor details to be checked, but before the end of this year, I hope our investigations will prove that it is Linnaeus' original manuscript for the printing of the first edition of his Systema Naturae. That would be a worthy end of the Linnaeus year in 2007. Ears plate, with its many versions, I would call it one of the most famous in the history of botany. I have a copy with me here, which I would like to hand over to the Library of the Smithsonian Institution.